Get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid. And today, this channel is about a story that I wish I'd known last month in October when I was telling all those creepy stories, because it's kind of creepy, but there's nothing supernatural about it or paranormal. It's, I could not imagine being in a position the man-centered that this story was in, and the decision he had to make, the decision that he did make, and how it affected his life forever after, and perhaps his afterlife. So I ran into an old friend here just a few days ago that I have not seen since 2006. I remember the year because I remember around the last time I saw this woman. She's a woman. She's in her early 60s now. It was Thanksgiving, and as of this recording, we're only about 10 days away from Thanksgiving. I remember it was 2006 because that's the year that I got separated from my first wife and went through that whole nasty divorce thing. And this woman and her then fiance, who she would later marry, while I was in Iraq, I would find out, they knew I was going to be alone. They knew I didn't have my kids that day. They had both been divorced. They had children who were adults by this point. They were concerned for me, and so we weren't like the best of friends. We were certainly much more than acquaintances. They invited me to have Thanksgiving with them at their place. It was at the woman's place. They weren't married yet. And she told me that her parents were coming down from somewhere in New England. I can't remember exactly where they're from. And I would have the chance to meet them. I took them up on their very kind offer. Had a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving dinner at their place. They have a beautiful estate down here right outside of Charlottesville, and then their place up there in New England. And I remember that might be the first time I ever ate oyster Rockefeller in my life. And I think they explained that that was like a New England tradition to have that as like an appetizer for Thanksgiving. It was delicious. So there was something very interesting about my friend's father. He had been a priest in his youth. He came from a very privileged family. They were wealthy, generational wealth. So much like in a video I made just yesterday where I was talking about how, you know, it would be a beautiful thing if we could do the things that we love doing, not for the sake of money, but simply because we love doing them, and not have to worry about finances. This guy was in that unique position since he was, you know, what we call trust baby around here. He was able to follow his heart and not have to worry about following his wallet. And he entered the priesthood. He was strong in his faith. He had been raised Catholic. He loved the culture, the traditions of the Catholic Church, and it's something he wanted to be a part of. And he made his vow of celibacy, swore an oath to the seal of confession, all these things that, you know, these guys have to do to become priests. He did it. And the story that I was given on Thanksgiving, and up until then, was that it was my friend's mother who had been a parishioner of the young priest that kind of got him out of the priesthood because he fell in love with her. And so when I met them and they slightly went over that story again, I said to the guy, I said, well, that must have been a very difficult decision for you to make. It must have been really hard. And he says, it wasn't hard at all. It was the easiest decision I've ever made in my life. Look at my wife. She's gorgeous. And she was. And he said, look at my daughter. And she had some sisters. He said, my girls are all beautiful and we have a wonderful life. And he said, I'm still very faithful to God, very much a practitioner of Christianity, but he was just no longer a servant to the Catholic Church. I thought, wow, that's truly a tale of true love. And I have not thought about this probably since I hadn't thought about these people. I ran into this lady the other day, and she goes back and forth between here and up north. And she did get married, but unfortunately her husband died. We dropped out of contact, as I did with so many people that I knew before I went to the war, and then spent 6 years in the Philippines. And so there was never, any ill will, nothing bad had happened. And she remembered that I wanted to write. At the time that we knew each other, I was still a stockbroker, and I hated that job. I was good at it, but I just felt like I was doing it for the sole purpose of making money, because I was. And that was part of the, problem with and listen, I'm not blaming my ex-wife, but when we met in college, I was a writer, and she knew I wanted to write. When we got out of college, graduated, and she said it was time to stop writing my haunted fairy tales and get a job where I made a lot of money so she could spend it. And in proper, at the time, beta male fashion, I said, yes, ma'am. And that's what I did. And I didn't write for 8 years. And made a lot of money. And every time I had a big month, I just felt empty. I was like, there's got to be more to the purpose of my existence than to just generate money. And it was never enough. If I made 10 grand, she'd spend 12. If I made 12, she'd spend 15. That's just how it was. So on top of the feelings of emptiness, as if all I'm doing is generating revenues, I didn't even get to keep any of it. And I would say, we should save. We should pay off what debt we have and start accumulating some wealth. And she would just get upset, and she'd cry sometimes and say, Kevin, we're middle class. This is what middle class people do. They go into debt. Whatever. But I was not a perfect husband, and I made very bad decisions too. So that wasn't even supposed to be part of the story. Anyway, I shared with my friend, I do write, and I've done okay with it. And I mentioned this YouTube channel, and she had no clue. She had no idea what I got her caught up to speed of, being married now. Dearly wasn't with me, my wife. And I asked her how her parents were after we'd talked at length. And I told her about the kind of stories I write, and I told her about the kind of stories I tell when I make videos on here. And she said, there's something very interesting about my father and about my mother and the truth behind their relationship that she said she didn't know until just a few years back. Her father never told her. Oh, I know it. Somebody's dragging a trailer on a truck up some old dirt road or something out there. That's all that is. I thought I heard like a tree knock, but it wasn't. So she told me I could tell this story, but of course I could not use their names because these are real people. This is a real family, and there are other real families and real people involved. And so I won't, and I haven't. But she explained that her father died several years back, and then her mother passed away just a couple of years ago. And her mother told her the truth as to why her father left the priesthood. Let me tell you, the old guy, he was a pretty good bluffer, claiming that it wasn't a hard decision to make. It turns out that when this priest was maybe a year into his priesthood, still so young, still new at it, a man came to him to confess a murder. The story was that another man had been wrongfully convicted, and he was sentenced to death, execution, and they were within a week or so of executing this man who had not committed this crime. And the man who had come to confess to the priest told him, he said, look, the guy that he murdered was one of his best friends. They had been out drinking. They'd gone back to his friend's place, and they continued to drink. They started gambling. The guy claims that he was winning continuously, and his friend started accusing him of cheating. They got into an argument. They were drunk. Words became blows, and they got into a fist fight. And he went too far. He choked the guy out like in like a MMA style fashion, and he didn't let go. He killed the guy, and he got scared and he left. He fled. It was the next day or the day after when somebody else came to that guy's house because he'd been calling him, couldn't get in touch with him, so he went to his house. The door, when the guy fled, he didn't even close the door, so the door was open. So he goes in and finds the body, the dead body, and he was now the number one suspect. He had no alibi, and as it would come to be, he would be the one who would be convicted of the murder, a murder he did not commit, though nobody believed him, no alibis, and he was sentenced to death. So the priest told the man, when he came to confess to him, he says, I would recommend you do the right thing here and you go to the authorities and you confess. And the guy said, I know I should, but I don't want to because they're going to execute me. He goes, I've been walking around with this weight hanging around my neck like an albatross, since this all happened. He said, I know an innocent man is going to die for the crime I committed, and I feel like I'm committing a second murder because of this. But at the same time, he said, I don't want to be executed. He says, can you absolve me? Can you tell me, how many prayers, what to say? And the priest refused. He said, no, I can't. And he said, as a matter of fact, he said, what I'm tempted to do is go to the authorities myself. And that is when the confessor reminded him. He said, you can't do that. The seal of confession, you cannot do that. And I guess that's one of the biggest breach of contracts, perhaps, that a priest from the Roman Catholic Church could make. So he tried bluffing the guy. He even went as far as to pick up the phone and say he was calling the police. And at that point, the guy laughed at him and said, no, you're not. I know you're not. And the priest begged him. He said, there's still time. There's not much, but there's still time. Please do the right thing. Please do the right thing. Well, the guy never did. And a couple weeks or a month later or whatever, an innocent man was executed for a murder he didn't commit. That weighed on the mind of this priest so heavily. He knew he had upheld his oath he'd taken with the church, but he felt as if he had betrayed his God by knowingly allowing an innocent man to be executed for a murder he didn't commit. And to add insult to injury, he would find out a couple of years later that the real killer had been riddled with so much guilt and remorse that he made the choice to take his own life. And he left a letter, and in that letter he confessed to having murdered his friend several years before, and he left details in the letter that were never released to the public, so only the authorities would have known these details, the authorities and the true killer, of which this man was. And so that was like a double whammy to the priest, because now he felt like, okay, I let this one man die innocently, and then the man who would have taken his place, so to say, at the gallows, ended up taking his own life just a couple of years later. So he felt like, what was the point of all of this? Just for me to be riddled with guilt and shame and have to live with this for the rest of my life? And he still loved the church. He still loved the tradition. He still very much was, until he died, a very faithful servant of God. But he just felt as if he couldn't do it the way he was expected to do it after those events. And he actually went to the woman that he would marry. She was, like I said, she attended mass at his church, and they were friends. They were friendly with each other. And he just kind of, I think she had gone to him for confession, and there was something that she felt terrible about, and she was upset, and he just broke down And he told her this stuff, and he realized that at that time he had breached his contract, because they're not supposed to tell anybody, not just the authorities, but no one. You know, supposedly anything you tell a priest, they cannot repeat. So I think in recent times the courts have tried to order the church to breach that contract if there were instances of abuse, and the church refuses to do it. They're kind of sticking tight to their guns in regard to that particular tradition. So he realized he had breached that contract with this young woman, for whom he knew at the time, and for some time he had feelings for anyway. And it was shortly after that that he left the church. He resigned. He took off the collar and never put it back on. He got involved with this woman. They started dating. They ended up getting married. They had 3 or 4 daughters, one of which was my friend that, like I said, that I ran into here just a few days ago for the first time since 2006. And other than his wife, who he told all those years ago, he took that story to his grave, as well as a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of remorse, a lot of confusion. And my friend told me that her mother had intended on taking that story to their grave as well, but she felt that her daughters, she told them all, had a right to know. And I told my friend, yeah, you're right. That would be one heck of a story to tell on my channel. And she said, just don't use my name. Don't use my family's name. Don't tell them where we live. And I said, absolutely. I will not breach that trust. I've never heard anything like that before in my life. What a crazy story. I hope to see you here again tomorrow for another one.